December 15th, 1966, Chicago. The Blues Workshop sat tucked between a pawn shop and a liquor store on the south side, its neon sign flickering against the early winter darkness. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the kind of reverence reserved for sacred places. This wasn't just another club. This was where Chicago blues lived and breathed, where legends proved themselves nightly, where the ghosts of Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf seemed to hover in the shadows between songs. The venue held maybe 150 people on a good night, but tonight felt different. Word had spread through the city's tight-knit blues community that some of the scene's biggest names would be sitting in. Big Eddie Thompson, whose guitar work had defined Chicago blues for a generation, nursed a whiskey at a corner table. Chicago Sam Williams, the harmonica player who'd backed everyone from Little Walter to Sonny Boy Williamson, sat nearby, his weathered hands wrapped around a beer bottle. Blues Johnny Miller, whose voice could make grown men cry, held court at the bar, telling stories that had already become legend. These were the kings of Chicago blues, men who'd earned their stripes in the juke joints and recording studios that birthed a musical revolution. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, an informal gathering of masters sharing their craft with whoever was lucky enough to witness it. In the back corner, almost invisible in the dim lighting, sat a young black man with an enormous afro and clothes that looked like they belonged in London, not the south side of Chicago. Jimi Hendrix clutched a Fender Stratocaster, its white body gleaming under the stage lights. At 24, he looked even younger, his thin frame swimming in a military surplus jacket decorated with patches and pins that marked him as an outsider in this temple of tradition. Jimmy had been back from London for exactly 3 weeks. His stint with Chaz Chandler and the London blues scene had taught him things about guitar playing that couldn't be learned anywhere else. But London was a world away from Chicago, and what worked in the clubs of Soho might not translate to the birthplace of electric blues. He'd come tonight not to perform, but to listen, to learn, to pay respect to the masters who'd created the foundation upon which all modern blues was built. But Marcus Webb, the Blues Workshop's owner and booker, had different plans. Webb was a legend himself, a former bass player who discovered more blues talent than any single person in Chicago. His word carried weight, and when he suggested someone sit in with the house band, that suggestion carried the force of commandment. "Got a young cat here," Webb had announced earlier that evening, gesturing toward Jimmy's corner table. "Just back from playing in London, says he knows some blues." The response from the established players had been polite, but lukewarm. London was fine for rock and roll, they figured, but real blues came from real places. Real struggle. Real life. What could some kid who'd been playing for British audiences know about the music that came from Mississippi cotton fields and Chicago steel mills? As the evening progressed, Jimmy watched the masters work. Big Eddie's guitar sang with the authority of someone who'd lived every note he played. Chicago Sam's harmonica seemed to channel voices from another world. Blues Johnny's vocals carried the weight of authentic experience, each phrase earned through years of paying dues in ways that couldn't be faked or learned from textbooks. But something else was happening, as Jimmy observed. These performances, magnificent as they were, followed predictable patterns. Traditional song structures, familiar progressions, established techniques passed down through generations of blues players. There was profound beauty in this tradition, but there was also limitation, safety, the comfort of known territory. Jimmy's mind raced as he listened, hearing not just what was being played, but what wasn't being played. What might be possible if traditional blues structures were pushed beyond their conventional boundaries? What if feedback wasn't a mistake to be avoided, but a texture to be explored? What if volume became part of the emotional vocabulary? What if the guitar could do things that hadn't been attempted yet? But these were dangerous thoughts in a room full of purists. Around 11 p.m., during a break between sets, Jimmy overheard a conversation that changed everything. Big Eddie and Chicago Sam were standing near the bar, their voices carrying just far enough for him to catch fragments of their discussion. "Marcus wants to give the London boy a shot," Big Eddie said, his tone suggesting mild amusement. "The young cat in the corner? What's he gonna play? Some British blues?" Chicago Sam's laugh was good-natured but dismissive. These kids come back from Europe thinking they've learned something new. Like blues is something you can study in school. Kid probably knows 3 chords and thinks he's ready for the big leagues. Big Eddie continued. We'll give him his 5 minutes. Let him play something safe, then get back to the real music. Might be good for a laugh, Sam agreed. Long as he doesn't embarrass himself too badly. Poor kid probably doesn't even know how out of his depth he is. The conversation drifted to other topics, but Jimmy sat frozen in his chair, processing what he just heard. 5 minutes. Something safe. Good for a laugh. The casual dismissal stung, but more than that, it ignited something deep in his chest. A familiar feeling he'd carried since childhood. The sensation of being underestimated because of how he looked, how he spoke, where he came from. But Jimmy was no longer the uncertain kid who'd enlisted in the army to escape his circumstances. London had taught him things about his own capabilities that he was only beginning to understand. Tonight, these masters were about to learn something too. Marcus Webb approached his table, interrupting his thoughts. You ready to play something, son? Got about 10 minutes before the next set starts. Jimmy looked up, and for the first time all evening, his expression had changed. The nervous reverence was gone, replaced by something harder, more focused. Yes, sir, Jimmy said, standing up with his Stratocaster. I'd like to play something. As Jimmy walked toward the small stage, conversations throughout the club gradually died down. The regulars who frequented the blues workshop knew that when someone new took the stage, it was worth paying attention. Either they were about to witness something special, or they were about to see someone humiliate themselves publicly. Both possibilities held entertainment value. Jimmy plugged his Stratocaster into the house amplifier, a small Fender twin reverb that had seen better decades. The guitar's white body seemed to glow under the stage lights, its curves and contours looking almost alien compared to the worn Gibson and Epiphone instruments the Chicago players preferred. Even his choice of instrument marked him as an outsider. He spent a moment adjusting the amp settings, turning knobs that the house musicians rarely touched. More volume, more gain, different EQ settings that made the guitar sound brighter, more cutting than the warm, round tones that characterize traditional Chicago blues. From his position at the bar, Chicago Sam watched with growing skepticism. This kid was already making changes, already trying to impose his own sound on music that didn't need fixing. What are you going to play? Marcus Webb asked from the edge of the stage. Jimmy looked out at the audience, his eyes finding the table where Big Eddie and Chicago Sam sat watching with expressions of polite interest mixed with barely concealed amusement. He'd chosen his song carefully, something these masters would know inside and out, something so fundamental to Chicago blues that any deviation would be immediately obvious to everyone in the room. Sweet Home Chicago, Jimmy said simply. A murmur ran through the crowd. Sweet Home Chicago was blues gospel, a song so essential to the Chicago sound that every musician in the room could play it in their sleep. It was also completely safe, exactly the kind of predictable choice they'd expect from someone trying not to embarrass himself. Big Eddie leaned back in his chair, his expression relaxing. The kid had made the smart choice. Play something familiar, get through it without major mistakes, accept the polite applause, and sit back down. Crisis averted. Jimmy positioned his fingers on the fretboard and looked back at the house rhythm section, 2 local musicians who'd been backing visiting players all evening. They nodded, ready to provide the steady, traditional foundation that Sweet Home Chicago required. Then Jimmy struck the first chord. What came out of that Fender twin reverb wasn't the gentle, rolling introduction that every blues fan in Chicago knew by heart. This was something else entirely. The chord rang out with sustain and power that seemed to fill every corner of the room, harmonics climbing into frequencies that traditional blues didn't explore. There was feedback, controlled and musical, adding texture instead of noise. Every conversation in the blues workshop stopped mid-sentence. Jimmy's left hand moved across the fretboard with fluid precision, finding voicings that were familiar yet completely transformed. The traditional chord progression was there, recognizable to anyone who knew the song, but it was being presented through a sonic prism that revealed colors nobody had known existed. His right hand worked with techniques that seemed impossible, behind-the-back playing that wasn't showboating, but genuinely musical, using the guitar's tremolo bar to create pitch bends that added vocal-like expressiveness to sustained notes. And then he started singing. Jimmy's voice wasn't the gravelly, world-weary growl that typically characterized Chicago blues vocals. It was smoother, more melodic, but it carried an emotional weight that spoke to experiences beyond his years. "Come on, baby, don't you want to go?" he sang, and the familiar lyrics took on new meanings in his interpretation. This wasn't a tired bluesman singing about escape. This was someone who'd already made the journey, who understood both the leaving and the arriving. But it was his guitar playing that was redefining everything anyone in that room thought they knew about blues music. Jimmy wasn't abandoning the traditional structure of Sweet Home Chicago. He was expanding it, revealing possibilities that had always been there, but had never been explored. His solos built and released tension, using dynamics that ranged from whisper-quiet passages, where individual notes hung in the air like suspended conversations, to explosive sections where the guitar seemed to scream with joy and pain simultaneously. At his table, Big Eddie had stopped drinking. His whiskey sat forgotten as he watched Jimmy's hands, trying to understand how fingers could move that fast while maintaining such musical clarity. These weren't just technical exercises. Every note served the song's emotional arc. Every technique contributed to a larger musical statement. Chicago Sam found himself leaning forward, straining to hear the subtleties of Jimmy's harmonic choices. The chord substitutions were sophisticated, borrowing elements from jazz and R&B that elevated the traditional blues structure without destroying its essential character. This wasn't some kid copying what he'd heard. This was someone reimagining the very foundations of the music. Blues Johnny, the vocalist who dominated Chicago stages for 15 years, listened to Jimmy's singing with growing amazement. The phrasing was intuitive, the emotional expression authentic. This young man wasn't imitating the blues singers he'd obviously studied. He was finding his own voice within the tradition. As Jimmy approached the song's climax, he began incorporating techniques that nobody in the room had ever seen applied to blues music. He used controlled feedback to sustain notes far beyond their natural decay, creating layers of harmony with himself. His vibrato was wider and more expressive than traditional blues playing typically allowed. He made the guitar talk, cry, and scream in ways that seemed to expand the very definition of what the instrument could do. The final chord rang out with such power and sustain that it seemed to hang in the air long after Jimmy's hands had left the strings. For a moment that felt eternal, the blues workshop was completely silent. 150 people sat in absolute stillness, processing what they'd just experienced. Then the applause began. It started slowly, scattered clapping from different sections of the audience. But it built quickly, growing in volume and intensity until it became something Jimmy had never experienced before. Sustained applause from musicians who understood exactly how difficult what he just accomplished actually was. Big Eddie was the first of the masters to stand, his ovation genuine and thunderous. Chicago Sam followed, shaking his head in amazement. Blues Johnny remained seated, but his applause was steady and respectful, the recognition of one artist acknowledging another. But the real validation came from the younger musicians scattered throughout the audience. Guitar players who'd been studying blues for years sat with their mouths open, recognizing that they'd just witnessed someone redefine the boundaries of their chosen instrument. Harmonica players and drummers who thought they understood the limits of blues, music found themselves reconsidering everything they thought they knew. Jimmy set his Stratocaster back in its stand and looked out at the audience, many of whom were now on their feet. For the first time all evening, he allowed himself to smile. Not the uncertain expression he'd worn in the corner, but a grin of pure satisfaction and relief. Marcus Webb was the first to reach him as he stepped off the stage. "Son," Webb said, his voice carrying genuine amazement. "I've been running this club for 20 years, and I've never heard Sweet Home Chicago played like that." But even as he praised Jimmy's performance, Webb was troubled. What Jimmy had done was undeniably powerful, but it challenged the very foundations of what Chicago blues was supposed to be. The traditional structures, the familiar techniques, the predictable progressions. Jimmy had respected them all while simultaneously transcending them completely. "You've got something special," Webb continued, "but this kind of playing, it's going to change things. Not everyone's going to be ready for that." Jimmy nodded politely, but inside he was no longer the nervous young man who'd arrived at the blues workshop that evening. He'd felt the power of connecting with an audience of masters, had experienced the electricity that flowed when musical tradition met innovation. Marcus Webb could worry about change, but Jimmy now understood what was possible. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Musicians who dismissed him hours earlier were now seeking him out, wanting to understand how he'd achieved the sounds they just heard. Big Eddie approached with genuine admiration. "Son, I've been playing blues for 30 years, and you just showed me things about my own instrument I didn't know existed?" Chicago Sam was more direct. "That wasn't just good playing. That was revolutionary. You took our music and made it bigger without making it less." Even Blues Johnny, typically reserved with newcomers, shook Jimmy's hand warmly. "You've got something I've never heard before. Don't let anybody tell you to change it." But the most important moment came when a young guitar player approached Jimmy near the club's exit. He was maybe 19, carrying a battered Gibson acoustic, his eyes wide with the excitement of someone who'd just witnessed his future. "I want to play like that," the kid said simply. "How do I learn to play like that?" Jimmy looked at this young musician and saw himself just a few years earlier, hungry, searching, knowing there was more to music than what tradition offered, but not sure how to find it. "Start with what you know," Jimmy said quietly. "Learn the tradition completely. Then ask yourself what else might be possible." Word of that December night spread through Chicago's music community like wildfire. Within a week, club owners were calling Marcus Webb, asking if they could book that young guitarist who reinvented Sweet Home Chicago. Record producers who specialized in blues were making inquiries. Musicians who'd been playing the same arrangements for years were suddenly experimenting with new sounds, new techniques, new possibilities. But Jimmy had already moved on. The experience was forming, London was calling again, and the world was waiting to discover what this young man could do with proper recording equipment and unlimited creative freedom. Years later, after Jimmy had become a legend, after Woodstock and Electric Ladyland, and all the achievements that would define his tragically brief career, those who'd been at the Blues Workshop that December night would tell the story with a mixture of pride and amazement. Big Eddie, in an interview decades later, put it simply, "I thought I knew what blues guitar could do. Then I heard Jimmy play Sweet Home Chicago, and I realized I'd been thinking too small." He didn't destroy the tradition, he set it free. Chicago Sam was more reflective. "That night taught me the difference between preserving music and imprisoning it. Tradition should be a foundation, not a ceiling." Marcus Webb, who continued running the Blues Workshop until his retirement, would often point to the small stage where Jimmy had performed. "That's where blues music grew up," he'd tell visitors, "where someone proved that respecting tradition and transcending it weren't contradictory goals." The young guitar player who'd approached Jimmy that night went on to become a respected session musician himself. In interviews, he would always reference that December evening as the moment he understood that mastery meant more than perfect imitation. "Jimmy showed me that the goal wasn't to play blues exactly like the masters who came before," he'd explain. "The goal was to understand the music so completely that you could take it places it had never been." Today, when young guitarists study the history of blues music, they learn about the night a 24-year-old with a white Stratocaster walked into Chicago's Blues Workshop and redefined what was possible. They learn that the greatest innovations often come from those who master tradition completely before daring to expand its boundaries. The performance lasted 10 minutes. The revolution it sparked continues still. The next time you feel dismissed, underestimated, or told that your approach doesn't fit established expectations, remember Jimi Hendrix standing on that small Chicago stage. Remember that sometimes the most profound respect for tradition comes from refusing to let it remain static. Some voices are too innovative to silence. Some visions are too bold to ignore. Some artists are destined to expand the very definition of what's possible. Jimi Hendrix knew this in his soul, and on that December night in 1966, he made Chicago's blues legends know it too.